So like a crooked path in a Ming garden, we've got a long distance to cover in a short time. And so I'd like to start with here. Let's see. And I've got two diagrams that I want to cover with you. The first is based on the title of the topic, and we'll cover this in more detail, but this is a diagram that I created a few years ago, starting with the 3579 column hall and its status and variation. We'll go through that. And then we've got this matrix that we're going to fill in. It's got 10 different items or types of things going on in the garden itself, and the architecture, and the pavilions based on our Portland Lanson garden. So we'll fill that in, and it's based on status and hierarchy and the elements. So, but to start all of that, I want to tie it all together, and I'm a little bit more interested in just matrices and diagrams. So I created a story that takes places on 4 timelines. So I have a little debate going with my wife. How many of you are familiar with the movie Inception? So Inception. So we got a few. Okay.
The wife was right.
Yeah. Okay. So Inception is a modern movie that takes place on multiple levels of consciousness at the same time. And these men have a mission to achieve on multiple mental levels, and they can share the mental levels as they go, and they go back and forth. So basically, this is sort of doing the same thing. I'm starting my main character, Hairui. I'm going to try to use HR because it's simpler to use. Is a very famous scholar official from the Ming Dynasty, and he was based in Suzhou in 1569 and 70. He was very, very well recognized as someone with total honesty and sincerity, to the point that he was sentenced to death for criticizing the emperor, and we'll go into that a little bit more. Jumping to 1959, Wuhan versus Yuan. 1959, Wuhan wrote a story, a play, based on Hairui's life, using it as a metaphor. Yao Wenyan was a high-ranking official in Mao's government and started writing articles in 1964-63 criticizing Wuhan's play, which became the Cultural Revolution. Wuhan and other playwrights had done other plays based on Hairui, and Wuhan and other playwrights were actually killed during the Cultural Revolution because of Hairui's plays, or the topic. Hairui's tomb was actually destroyed, and his remains were incinerated during the Cultural Revolution. But if you go to Hainan Island now, Haikou is the main city in Hainan Island. There is now a new shrine that has been built for Hairui. I'm going to have Hairui walking through the Master of Fishnet's garden. There's a discrepancy in the timeline there, because Master of the Fishnets actually, which for those of you who are not aware, Master of the Fishnets is probably the closest garden to our Portland Suzhou's, Lansu. In size, it's considered our closest tie. But Master of Fishnets is sort of unique in itself, in that it was built in the Song, basically went abandoned, and then wasn't rebuilt until the Qing Dynasty, based on Ming. So Fishnet is sort of like post-Ming architecture, like our postmodern architecture. And then our garden, Lansu, that matrix that you see we're going to fill in, is all based on Lansu garden. So the story for Hairui starts with Hairui as a government official in Suzhou starting in 1567, and we'll call this 1570. And this is the main, we're looking north to south, and Hairui gets an invitation to join what I'm going to call the fictitious family Chen, to Master of the Fishnet garden, which is right back up here. So his journey through the city starts along that path. And I call it Roofscapes of the city, because whenever you look at an overall picture of a Chinese town, village, almost anything, you can read the hierarchy of that town village. If you watch a Chinese movie, you can, like, they usually show an overview of the village, and just by the hierarchy of the roofs, you can understand the hierarchy of the townscape. And it's based on very simple things where you have the lowest class building here, and then you can see it becomes a little bit more and more and more, and it's very recognizable. And here's another diagram showing the same kind of thing. And there's very interesting subtleties there as you go up in hierarchy as well. But it's just as simple as that in terms of very visual clues recognize the roofscape of his memory. So Hairui is walking along through Suzhou and looking at the roofscapes and over bridges, and has a few memories of Beijing, his time with the emperor. His memories of his childhood in Hainan. This was a garden that was built just at the time that he was born, memorizing or commemorating 5 scholars who were exiled by a previous emperor to Hainan Island. And so this is a temple in Hainan. You can see it's very tropical. It's basically across Hanlin Bay from North Vietnam. And you can see it's very tropical, but this is a temple of the 5 scholars commemorating their exile. So these are in his memory. But here we go. So here's Hainan. So you have Vietnam, Hainan Island. There's Hong Kong, basically back up in here. There's Taiwan across there. Here's Hainan Island in detail. Some of the local building you can see is built out of almost like a sea stone type of stonework here. You can see it's a basic gable building. And so these buildings throughout most of the Chinese agricultural areas is what I call the 3-column hall, or the 3-purlin hall. And so the way you look at that is here's column 1, 2, and 3. You have a primary hall, and then you have the eaves, which typically on a farmhouse are filled in. And this Lubang Ying from 507 BC was one of the very first that's been recorded that I found as codifying how you build within Chinese culture. And I like these red things here. Whoever builds a house with 3 purlins on Banzhou must look for favorable measurements. If width and height are determined according to this method, in the future many good sons will be brought forth. Right? So it pulls in everything, right? The how you build, the virtues that will occur if you build well. When you get into the city, in Confucius, and I'm jumping around here a little bit, the highest rank in Confucian society is the scholar officials and the emperor, obviously, and then you have the farmers and craftsmen, people that make things. The lowest level in Confucius society are the merchants who don't really produce anything in society. They just buy and sell and make profit and make life easier. And so, when you're in the city, typically the merchant, it's based on obviously both size and so forth, but you have a 5-column hall. And so you can see the 5 purlins. Do you know what purlins are? Okay, so purlins are the long beams. You have the columns that are holding things up, and the purlins run along the top of the columns. Okay, and so when you talk about 5-column hall or 5-purlin hall, these red lines would be the purlins. So there's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so again, using this Lubang from 507, here's the 5-column hall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the purlins are these beams right there. With 5 purlins in 3 bays, this is again from 507 BC, right? If the timbers are measured according, life in it will be peaceful with abundance of luck, and sudden wealth will enter the house time and again. Right? So a merchant's hall is perfect for a 5-purlin hall. So here we go, eaves, primary hall, and this starts showing my color coding here. So you have the primary hall and a secondary interior hall that can be combined in various ways. And then a lot of times this eave is either outside, inside. So when I'm talking about Confucius, and I know I'm talking to an audience that knows their stuff here, But there's hundreds of these diagrams out here. Confucianism he was born, Confucius in 551 BC, Lao Tzu was born in 601, very almost overlap. And they've always been overlapping and intertwined, and it's this wonderful yin-yang between Taoism, which for those of us that really love the symbolism in the garden in Lao Tzu and have seen my other talks, I prefer the looseness and the one with all type stuff, the touchy-feely of Taoism. But this Confucianism is important to work with, understand, and it's this, basically the status of society and the structure. Human hierarchies have run the course, whether it's bullies on the playground, gorillas, and their society. One of my favorite diagrams, I lived in Vienna actually for almost a year, is the Vienna. And Austrian society was totally stratified, had very little degree of social mobility, and as a result, social distinctions were very clear, let alone the diagram. Here's where the king lives, right there in the palace. The wealthiest here, protected by this huge moat and fortification system, which beat back the Ottomans. And then you have the middle class out here, and then the farmland out here. You couldn't be more clear in the diagramming of the hierarchy of Viennese society. And so HR is moving through the city, and he gets to master the fishnets. So this is a little bit more detail on master the fishnets. You can see it's similar in size to Lao Tzu. This is one of the most famous views of master the fishnets, and we'll talk about this in that pavilion right there. And as I said, it's post-Ming architecture in that it was abandoned and then rebuilt in 1765. The Ming dynasty starts in 1644, right? So, the Ming to Qing is 1644. So it's pretty late, almost over 100 years after the Ming dynasty, yet it's built, the gardens were built in Ming dynasty style. And so one of the things that gives that away is here you're walking along the canal, and you get to this outside plaza and a very ornate front door. And you can see this very linear assemblage of this hall. That is very Qing, very European, central axis. And one of the things but Feng Shui-wise very interesting is this family was wealthy enough to be able to purchase this piece. And so by Feng Shui energy, flying through this central space, they had a reception hall with this as wall, right? And so this flying energy out that main axis got captured in here. Here's the street running this way. So Hai-Rui was invited in my story, to visit Yaji, a gathering of scholars in this garden. So he gets to this doorway, and he starts thinking of zigzag paths. So, completing this four-piece garden, here's our garden, Lan Su. The concept of our garden, Lan Su, to Yuan, Portland Suzhou Garden. David Wu, the congressman from Beaverton, and Mike Lindbergh, commissioner, in 1985 started the sister city relationship. The actual beginnings of the contracts to start designing Lan Su was 1991. I joined the Classical Chinese Garden Society in 1990. So I've been with the garden for almost 30 years in some way or another. And for those of you who know, this garden, our garden, is not without Chinese tragedy and politics. That the founders and the major energy of the people that started this garden, Classical Chinese Garden Society, were overthrown just before the garden opened, and we've benefited from a very well-run garden for the last 20 years. But there was definitely, in keeping with Chinese culture, a major overthrow just as the garden was about to be opened. So our garden, Lan Su, is just the garden portion of these large, very wealthy scholar pavilions or scholars' gardens from the Ming Dynasty. And these two diagrams, you can see the typical entrance compared to what I just showed you of master fishnets. The typical entries into a Ming garden, very understated no matter what the wealth is, usually very circuitous just as you enter and then turn. Because one, these are on narrow streets and evil spirits can only travel in straight lines, right? So if you have a very understated doorway, there's nothing for the evil spirit to catch into when you get to that door. Then if you turn multiple times in a little catch, see how this catches that movement there? That would catch any evil spirit that might happen to bounce in the door, right? And so our garden, Lansu, had a bunch of things that, and I'll talk about that in a second, to overcome this because we didn't build the intensity of the courtyards. So, like all things, moving through Chinese architecture, there's one book that was written by a Chinese architect from the south, in the South Yangtze area of China where Suzhou is the canal cities. And there's only a few of the canal cities left, and this architect was writing from there, and he talks about Chinese architecture as all about movement, both static and in motion type movement. And so this is our, the very famous crooked bridge of Lansu Garden. And one of my favorite examples, which I covered pretty extensively in my previous lectures in 2008 and 11, is those of you who are familiar with the painted boat in Misty Rain. There's 2 panels of ginkgo, 3 panels of ginkgo, and 1 panel of ginkgo that all equal the same amount of width, just divided in different ways. And it bounces the people, when you're in painted boat in Misty Rain, you bounce through here like water over rocks or pinball machine, and that creates the crooked path. So this starts our matrix. And so we have zigzag paths, starting with the ticket booth, zigzag path into the ticket booth. Traditionally it was supposed to be over that gateway in, but it's a fairly simple straight up to the, both the gift shop and the ticket booth, again the lowest status, right? Into the Yuan, into the Yuan room, one movement and then in. Half window circled in green. You're starting on the ubiquitous path, going along here. You can see the beginning of a crooked path and then you're in. Knowing the fish, you have this wonderful window that's underutilized right now, but there used to be a really nice display, almost a shrine type opening here that stops this hall, and then you turn into knowing the fish. So painted boat, so that's not, yeah, that's spring rain. Okay. Yeah. Crooked path into Moonlocking Pavilion. Multiple pathways in front of the tea house, Tower Cosmic Reflections. And then the 2 highest status halls in Lansu is the Celestial Hall, the Scholar Study, through this gate here. And you can see that, look at the axis here, you're stopped by those stones, you have to turn, and then you get in here, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And my most famous of these zigzag path entrances, again, we had to simplify everything in Lansu because of access. You're open to the public, everything had to be ADA, but then you come in here and from the entranceway, here's the ticket gatherer, and you hit these stones. And that's like one of the most important stones in the whole garden, and that it's not lining up with that window. The energy as you're coming in the door, it's this wonderful view of the osmanthus and then this type of rock. And then you are diverted to the left to get to the hollow rotated clouds. So then you get to entry thresholds. You have a farmhouse and the Forbidden City. You can see how it gets expanded and all extra levels and more thresholds. And so in Master the Fishnets, here's the entry, and you come in here, and HR is entering this courtyard right here, called the sedan chair courtyard, where, obviously the high-ranking visitors in a sedan chair were dropped off in this hall right here. The typical scholars, you can see a scholar's pavilion with an actual threshold here that you step up into. Our thresholds in Lansu are removable because of the ADA. One of my pre-9/11 jokes was that evil spirits and Americans can't step over thresholds. And so when I dropped that in 9/11, it didn't go so good after that. But this is our removable threshold, and you can see all of our doorways in Lansu are key for the removable thresholds. And so they were built with that understanding that this level of hall would have that size of a threshold. Again, we were supposed to be entering the whole garden through this gateway, but again, Americans had a lot of trouble with that step right there, and so these benches were put in about a year and a half, 2 years later. So the pavilion status, again, is just a classic little ADA ramp into the merchant hall, right? The merchant hall and gift shop, that's the lowest status. And then we start going up in status. Smooth entry, no separate threshold for the Yuan room, half window circling green. There's a little bit of a ramp that steps up in there. Knowing the fish, you have a sort of a formalized entry, and you're going through the two lions that help protect that entrance. Painted boat, you actually start getting a step to get up into it. This is my symbol for basically not applicable, and it's not worth going into at this point, so you'll see a couple of those, not a lot. Here's the tea house, the tower. You can see an actual major step onto this threshold, and then the actual threshold is actually built there because we're not using that as an entrance. The scholar study ADA ramp to get past. They didn't want to leave this off architecturally, so they have just a little ramp here, another step, then the threshold. You can see how the thresholds are expanding in status. And then hollow rotated clouds. You see a whole major staircase in itself, an entry porch, and then you're into the threshold. So you can see each of these elements will pick up in scale and detail as you go. So HR gets a little glimpse in that garden to the left, and you start seeing some scholar officials in this first pavilion. And HR is a little bit intimidated by this whole invitation because he didn't pass his scholar's exam. He worked on Hainan Island until he was 39 years old, basically as a school teacher and administrator, and then based on his reputation, was then hired into Beijing, even without his passing the scholar's exam. But he knew he was coming into this very prestigious gathering in the garden. And so this whole idea of meeting these scholars and stepping into the clouds is a whole over concept of the whole scholar's exam system, which set up the whole society of servicing the government from local all the way up to the emperor. And the inscription in the scholar study in Lansu is stepping into the clouds, and that's the short form of the ascendancy. It's basically a compliment, like when you pass your exams, you're stepping into the clouds. The process of getting through the scholar's exam is called ladder to the clouds. And again, it fits in our world as well. This is Chinese students taking an exam in today's world. And these were the testing courtyards of, I think this is the Beijing one, and I have also one from Shanghai. These are the rows of these testing booths. And so this is an old plan of the Beijing Scholars Exam Center. These gates were locked. It was a 3-day all-nighter. And I find it fascinating that even SAT uses this form in the brutal fill in the blanks that we all have in the drawer, right? I mean, it's like just uncanny, the similarity of these two things, right? But I did a little count. Each one of these is a student's little cubicle for his 3-day all-nighter, right? So I did a little count. There's 1,288 there, and there's basically somewhere about 3,700 slots for scholars exams in that testing center. So 3,700 men were locked into this courtyard for a 3-day all-nighter to write their scholars exams. And each level of the exams, you only took the top 1% to move up through 8 levels. So imagine, for those of you that got 98 percentile on your SAT, you would not have passed a single level of your scholars exam. Right? So when we're talking about these scholars, these were probably the most magical geniuses of human history, really, to be able to even get anywhere near these exams. You were assigned a row based on the character of a story. And these are the characters of the story. And then you went down that row into your little cubicle right there. You were given 3 boards. You could make a little bed if you needed a nap. You could use it as a desk and a bench. And that was how you did your exam. So, HR makes that turn into that first pavilion. It's called Barrier of the Clouds Terrace. And so even in the name, this is the Master of the Fishnet's names, Barrier of the Clouds Terrace, right? So when you're stepping into the clouds, right, this first hall was sort of like understanding that there's a barrier to your scholarly success in that first hall. So, but the gentlemen are in there, and so he's made the turn, and he's in this hall here, and there's a gathering of scholars. And he sees his first officials with the badges on their clothing. And these badges, we look at them, they're amazing pieces of art. What you may not see right away is if they're birds, they're civil scholar officials. If they're animals, they're military. And there was this incredible hierarchy of different birds, right? And so what you sort of have to sort of understand with these badges is that the people in the know in society probably saw these badges like we understand makes of cars. When you see somebody driving down the road in a Pinto versus a high-end Mercedes, right? You just know it. It's status, it's class. And so when you see a golden pheasant versus a pigeon, so I mean, I'll give you a little bit more. So not pigeon, but crane or golden pheasant versus a quail or an oriole. Okay. So we'll give them a little bit more credit than that. And then lion versus rhinoceros. Right? And the other way of reading these is that the emperor sat in the middle. The civil servants sat to the east of the emperor. The emperor sat facing north to south. And the civil people sat to his left, and so their badge looked back toward the emperor, but their wife has her bird matching her husband's looking back toward the husband. Same thing with the military. Many of the military have the figures this way, but their head faces the emperor. You can see that line is turning this way. And then the wife badge meets her husband's. And so that's basically the overall organization of the scholar badge. So again, hierarchy in that. So HR is been listening to these men and they're pontificating, and he knows he's a little bit out of his league, and so he sort of drops his head a little bit and starts walking out of the pavilion, and he notices the column bases in the halls, and he starts looking at them, and they started in a very, very simple, small column base. So here's the column base at the ticket booth and the gift shop. This is one of my favorites. There's every one of these column bases changes slightly, and you can see there's a little bit of a granite base that this sits on in the Yuan room. All of this granite, if you don't know, in Lansu, all of the granite was hand chiseled, and so there's a little chisel texture in it. And when the garden first opened, they were very distinct, and it was said that the craftsmen could tell individual craftsmen's chiseling techniques and patterns. Some of them are still good after 20 years, but in high traffic areas, they're starting to wear a little bit. But anyway, so you get half window circle in green. You can see a little more vertical, but a similar, but slightly different position. And knowing the fish, they're buried in the corners there, but yet you still want you to see it a little bit. Painted boat, you can see just a smidge different, but a little bit more engaged. flowers washed in spring rain, a little bit more of a plinth on it. Then Moonlighting Pavilion, a completely unique one. It's squashed, it has a little ring on it, completely different, unique to the garden. Tea house, similar flower pot shape, but a little bit taller and bigger. Then you get to the scholar study, and you can see it's a whole other little proportion in itself. And then when you get to the Hall of Brocaded Clouds, it completely goes on its own. You have this is the only hall that has the lotus base column, and then the outer columns are multiple shapes. See how the has a you have the plinth, then you have a base on the pot, and then a whole other ribbed proportion system again. So you can see the column bases are really very, very distinct in terms of how it goes up in complexity and status. So far we've got 3 rows done. I'm going to skip the Namu panel. Just the Namu paneling, there's not a lot of variations. Some of them have been messed up a little bit in some of our maintenance, and only the last 2 at Scholars Hall and Hall of Brocaded Clouds are really worth working at. The window screens. So HR moves from the barrier of Clouds Terrace, and he goes into the next one on his own. He needs a little break. And this one's sort of interestingly called inside the Tassel Wash Pavilion. So you're near the water. You're maybe washing off. You're cleansing things from your cloak or whatever. And he's looking out through these windows. This is Master of the Fishnets, and he's noticing a gathering in this next pavilion across the lake. And then all of a sudden, a very high-ranking servant comes to greet him in this hall. And he is coming to bring a special invitation for HR to come visit Mr. Chen up in his study up here. So he said, I'll take you there. And this high-ranking servant, again, this is completely outside of our realm, but Lisa C. in her book, Peony and Love, talks about these high-ranking official gardens had 940 fingers in them. All right, and so when you look at 940 fingers, what does that mean? Well, in the garden of her story, there were 21 or 210 fingers, or 21 blood relatives living in this garden. There's 330 concubines, 330 fingers, 33 concubines. Concubines and daughters living in that garden, and 40 servants. And so that's the 400. So this servant was the highest ranking servant of the 40, essentially, in this hall, coming to greet HR, to invite him. And so here's the first hall, here's Tassel Wash Hall. And similar to our garden in Wansu, there's this elevated crooked path here with a very famous pavilion that's very similar to our Moonlighting Pavilion. And so the servant leads HR along this pathway, but HR realizes that there's another gathering here. And they're looking through the lead windows, similar to our lead windows in Wansu. And there's another gathering going on in that viewing porch looking at the pines. And there's basically a yaji, a group of scholars working on paintings there. And so here is the plan of Master Fishnets. He entered here, and you can see here's the Qing Dynasty access way. He came in through here, the Tassel Wash, he got the invitation, he's being led along this path. But there's this group of scholars working here, so he noticed he wasn't led in front of them. He looks through these lead windows here into this beautiful western garden here, and then back around, and then we're going to head for the staircase there. But he stops for a minute and watching the men painting, and in that looking at the pines, and noticing those views through the windows, screens, and lattice windows. So looking forward into Lan Su's windows and screens, we have the windows in the gift shop. The Yuan room has the first of the frame window, which is a three-part window system that also happens again in the scholar study. But then you have half window circling green, which basically is a wonderful window on itself, looking at its alternate world down that piece of the river. Knowing the Fish has very distinct frame views. This is obviously not a window, but it's a frame view. And for those of you who know me, this is my pet peeve ginkgo tree. That ginkgo, when the garden was first started, was considered a pygmy ginkgo, and it was a low umbrella ginkgo that was down here like this, over by the only Taihu rock in Lan Su, which is horizontal, so the alligator mouth one on the north wall, on the way to Knowing the Fish. This ginkgo was initially planted, and it was this beautiful little umbrella pygmy ginkgo down there, and then it was transplanted here, and then it got away from them, and it's now a lollipop ginkgo. And I tended to not make many comments, but this is one of the most important frame views in the whole garden, with the rose and the pine framing the view of the frozen rocks. And this ginkgo grew up right in its path, and then they lollipopped it there. And so that's my one criticism that I'll throw out there. So that ginkgo just drives me crazy, knowing where it was 20 years ago. So again, windows, and this is where painted boat really flies. You have the three ginkgo screens I'm talking about. It bounces you through in a water over rocks. I've always considered these windows when you walk into a museum gallery when there's too many paintings on the wall, and you're totally saturated, you can't see anything more, and you walk into this gallery and there's just so many paintings, but as you're moving through it, all of a sudden you just notice one, and you stop for a second, and you look at this one painting. So this Knowing the Fish is built that way, and that, inside a painted boat, is built this way, in that you're bouncing through here, and you might notice the frame view through maybe one or two of these little windows as you're going through. It's a very, very important aspect of that pavilion. So you have windows, flowers watching spring rain, obviously the frame views of the lake, the moon locking, obviously in itself. The tea house has wonderful expanded non-moon panel windows. These are the non-moon panels that I've skipped. And then you get into the non-moon lattice windows of the scholar study. You can see it's this, it's basically a rotated lattice pattern. And then the four-sided hall, or hall of rotated clouds. And you have this very, very, high status, glass on four sides, incredible status windows all the way around on all four sides, including these transoms up here. Everything about that hall is quite amazing that way. So HR is led past the scholars. Those lattice windows that are sort of piquing his attention through here, around and up to this little staircase, and he's being led to the second floor above here. And so here's the viewing porch for looking at pines and studying paintings, right? This hall here is called the Five Summits Reading Hut. And Five Summit Reading Hut is important to understand in Master of the Fish Nets compared to Lan Su's garden, Scholar's Hall. It's called the Celestial Hall of Permeating Fragrance. You'll notice our hall is called the Celestial Hall. The Celestial Hall, the word celestial, and this is right from Charles Wu's book, Listen to the Fragrance, which is super important. But here's the name of the hall, right? Celestial Hall of Permeating Fragrance. The term celestial is very important. This term celestial is made up of two characters. That little T shape is the symbol for man, and that's the symbol for mountain. And so man on a mountain is as close to heaven as you can get. Celestial. Okay, so our hall is called the Celestial Hall. When you're in this hall, you're as close to heaven as you can be. right? And so this is my favorite painting of that concept, right? Man on a mountain. You're as close to heaven. You're the celestial hall. Whereas the master of the fishnets named his hut, his library, the hut of 5 mountains. So master suite, secluded embodiment, ultimate self. That's my little poetry there. And so even in the name, it's fascinating. But yes, he's being humble to calling this a hut, but it's the hut of 5 mountains. The 5 mountains are the major 5 mountain pilgrimages throughout China that becomes like the highest ranking journeys that you can do. There's an emperor that would make sure that he got to all 4 mountain ranges during his rule here. And so the Chinese phrase for pilgrimage means paying one's respect to a mountain, seeing rocks in the garden, the invitation to make a mental journey to these sacred mountains. So even in his humbleness of calling it a hut, he is associating it with the journey of the 5 mountains. If you can't physically get to the 5 mountains, the next best thing is to read poetry and look at paintings about these kind of journeys, right? And so that's why a library then would be named that way. And so not only are the window screens, but then you have the ginkgo screens. And then so the ginkgo screens, these, as he's making that little corner at the top of the stairs and he's coming through these ginkgo screens, the craftsmanship, and this is our ginkgo screen from the scholar's study, is very impressive and blowing you away. And he makes the turn with this servant into the library, and he sees this image and he's taken aback because there's the, and I don't know for sure if this is actually Jia Jing, the emperor that sentenced him to death, but here's an emperor painting. But then he realizes that it's really Mr. Chen. But he's starting to get this experience as he's walking into the hall. And the ginkgo screens start with, again, a ticket booth, and then Yuan room. We have, this is one of the more interesting funds. Again, all of these status things inform the designers. What are the decisions the designers made when they decided to do this kind of screen or this kind of window or this kind of column? So when you're in the Yuan room, which is one of the least status halls, it's like the, I like to think of the Yuan room as the man cave. You know, the man cave in our society is usually in the basement, right? And even half window circle, the Yuan room is called Reflections and Clear Ripples. It's talking about sitting down at a table, playing backgammon, looking through the screens of the railing at the reflections and clear ripples of the water. But the ginkgo screen is only this little piece right here, right? And so they wanted to expand it in the transom essentially, and this is, I think, from what I was told, is maple. It's the only place that a maple transom occurs is and there's glass in here, on that dividing line at that purling line, right? So when we're talking about spaces, you're in the primary space here, and then this is that secondary space, like in the diagram, right? So, I'm sorry, went too fast there. So, knowing the fish, I'm sorry, keep on doing that. Painted boat, as I mentioned, has very, very important ginkgo screens. So this is the triple ginkgo screen, this is the double ginkgo screen, and then there's the single back there. Again, I've measured it out. It's the same width, just divided into 1, 2, and 3 pieces based on these layers. The multiple panels here are carved into. Sorry, wrong arrow. Obviously, the Flowers Washed in Spring Rain has these very, very important 6 panels of ginkgo screen with the illustrations here and the poems on the back. Skip over the next 2 pavilions, but then the Celestial Hall Permeating Fragrance has this wonderful ginkgo screen that's in the 3 parts of the frame window. And one of my favorite parts of the ginkgo screen in the scholar study are the exposed pegs. And all of this screen is all hand pegged. And if you want to really sort of get into the craftsmanship of that screen, sort of in almost more of a modern architectural kind of way, you can see it because you can see the miters and the pegs and how this whole thing is pieced together. But then when you get into hollow brocaded clouds, they step up even more, where it's the three friends of winter, which is plum, plum bamboo and pine, and it's in all three bays of the hollow brocaded clouds. Again, this is a different way of dividing up that second space. So you have a seating area, almost like an entrance hall, and a seating area in that same column spacing. But notice that the joinery is hidden in this screen, so it even ups the craftsmanship level. So we're making progress through here. So HR is sitting there in front of Master Chen, and he's painting, and he just sits there quietly, and Mr. Chen finally looks up, and the first thing he says to him is, "If you were required, how would you divide this painting amongst my brothers?" And HR is like sitting there thinking, now where's this going, right? And so Mr. Chen just sort of waits a little bit, and for the answer, and he says, I have some money, I'm getting older, and I want to invest in my family. And if I have money left over when I die, then the brothers fight. That painting could be cut into pieces. But if I invest in another hall for my garden, that's going to be very, very hard to dismantle, and the family will have to live together and stay together with this hallway, right? So building a scholar hall or expanding the garden or investing in the rocks of the garden, rocks are another issue that can be taken apart, but investing in these halls became an investment in the family's future. So Master Chen asks, so how I want to build a high status hall. And going back to Yuan, the construction of this house with this magnificent hall depends entirely on the clever planning of the craftsman, wealth, and rampant result proper measurements, but yin and yang must be taken into consideration too. So this is what I was talking about. When you have a 7-column hall, here's the primary hall. That is that secondary zone that I was talking about, where the daybed is, and the seating area, and hollow brocaded clouds. And you can do different things with it. Our typical thing the typical thing is that this becomes a circulation hall outside, and you enter in the primary hall, and then that's where the daybed is and scholar studies, essentially. But you can do it different things. You can make it all one space. You could have 2 circulation zones. There's lots of things you can do with the 7-column hall. And so here we go. So the second interior space, eaves and circulation. So taking that further, here is all of Lansu diagrams with my system of circulation. So get you oriented here. And let's see. I'm even getting spun around. Here we go. Here's the entrance. Here's the entrance gate. Here's the ticket booth. Here's knowing the fish, right? So you can sort of see here's circulation all the way around the hollow brocaded clouds. And then the primary space and the secondary space is back in there. Here's the tea house. Here's the scholar study. There's the secondary space, right? There's the master's. There's the actual scholar study that's adjacent to the primary hall and his secondary space. The red is the circulation, etc. So that's my system of looking at those spaces. And so the status of the 7-column hall section. This one is a little bit too elaborate, so let me go to this. So this was my modeling. I had an amazing draftsman that worked with me starting out of high school 10 years ago. And he was working with me when I first did this lecture in 2008, and he did these SketchUp studies with me. So again, the columns or purlins, so here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7-column hall. And there you get a little bit better sense of the space in there. But again, this is what I call it your primary hall. There's your secondary space, maybe circulation or a hallway, or you can combine it all together. lots of things you can do within there. And so Master Chen said, I want to build a high status hall, and HR is sort of, what should I say, he's honored that Master Chen is talking to him about that. They're talking about techniques, and so you're thinking about putting together a hall and making it. This is my favorite example of what Chinese architecture brought down to its simplest form. The most important piece right here is the Lu-Tu, which is like for those of you who worked with Lincoln Logs as a kid, the little mini one that just crisscrosses right here, right? That's this right there. And there's your Lu-Tu. And so then you have the Lu-Tu and the Haogang, and basically everything is just based on those stacking back and forth. So here, again, Lu-Tu. Here's the Ang. One of my favorite aspects of this diagram is that all of this stuff is basically like a teeter-totter. And so these rafters here, going back, are being held by this bracket system that brings the load back down here, right? When you had small pieces of rafters and you wanted to hold them up and create a bigger span here, right? These rafters needed to be pushed upwards. And so without having a column underneath here, you could do a little teeter-totter. Imagine putting a big kid down here and a little kid here is being pushed up. And so what they did is to help hold up this long rafter is they did a teeter-totter with all the weight on the eaves pushing down and pushing up there. So this is actually pushing upward in that piece of section. So it's really a wonderful thing. But basically, again, it's all of this complexity is basically brought down to that Lu-Tu piece. Right? There's our favorite little 4 pieces there. Right? So getting into the primary trusses of Lansu. Gift shot, and even the gift shot basically follows exactly the 5-column hall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Boom. So it's a merchant space. They built it as a 5-column hall. Yuan room is the classic 7th. There's the outside one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then frozen window, frame window 7 out there. One of the things when you're looking at that, when you're looking at these halls, and this is a classic case, is start looking at the complexity of the connection of the purlin to the column, and the complexity of the column. I call this a squashed column. Imagine this column being built out of clay, and they put the load of the roof here, and it squishes, because it's heavy, squishes it down. You notice it's a little bit paper, and it's sort of squished down, and it actually sort of wraps down over, it's being pushed down over that beam. So, so again, this is the simplest of Lansu's. Half window circled in green. There's some complexity and variation. This is the first time that the center ridge gets expanded. I still count this expansion of the center ridge into 2 as 1. They just use that as just, to make it a little fancier. They'll separate the ridge into 2 pieces here. But again, it's basically still in the 7-column hall counting. Knowing the fish is, it's hard to count 7 in here, but you can get there. But one of the really fascinating things of knowing the fish is that this is a square and this is a rotated square, and it's really sort of fun the way they spin the framing on that. So again, painted boat, they do the same thing where that's the ridge, but they split it into 2. And this space of painted boat is basically the cargo hold of a barge. And so this goes back to basically a 5-column. You have the outside bracket we'll talk about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So even the merchant space and painted hall is informed that way. Circled in green. This is one of the really interesting ones. almost, I don't ever really remember looking up into the moonlighting pavilion. There's so much to look at, obviously, that you don't ever really, think about it. But when I was taking pictures for putting this lecture together, I took a picture, looked up there, and I was, oh my God, they really cheated us on that one. They they decided to completely hide it. Who knows what they were doing up there, and to hide the framing, but they decided to do that, which is probably one of the most blatant cheats in the whole garden. But anyway, and then you have Tower of Cosmic Reflections, the tea house. Wild as heck, totally taking the whole idea of 7 columns and expanding it in all kinds of crazy ways. Again, there's the double ridge with this big, I call it an anvil rafter that's sitting on these big brackets that are holding this. But then they decided to drop the column here, right? If you go into the tea house, you'll notice there's stress cracks in the beams. And that's okay. Stress cracks, when wood breaks into stress cracks, it becomes multiple beams. And so the reason why it's stressing is because when a beam goes like this, the top part is in compression and the bottom is in tension, pulling, and there's a divide between the crunching fibers and the pulling fibers, and that's what creates a crack, right? But if you think about it, if you take one piece of bamboo and you load it, it's going to droop, right? But if you take 5 bundles of bamboo and you wrap them together, it's much stronger. And that's because you have 5 beams that are all bundled together now, acting in one. And so these cracks that you see in the tea house are similar to that. But there's just so much loading going on in that roof that they really went out on a structural limb in terms of playing with that structure. And then scholar study is the classic, but what you can see is these brackets start getting a little bit more ornate in the connections between column and purlin. And so they've expanded these connections a little bit more. And then hollow brocaded clouds, there's the anvil beam again, and you can see they split the ridge, and then you have these multiple stacked anvil column beams rather than the straight log beams. So again, the highest status of the primary framing of the primary hall. And then secondary arches. I call it, looking at the first column. The column is this little bracket here. So the first is how you expand it and how many times you expand that loading, right? And so what we're looking at is that this is the primary column and here's the primary hall. This secondary zone right here starts operating in different ways. So you can cantilever it all out. Notice that it's all being cantilevered onto that column here, or you can create another archway. And so you have the secondary brackets. So here's the ticket booth. And there is the secondary bracket. It's all tucked in nice and tight in that 5-column hall. Here's the first of the Yuan room. Here's the first of the simple secondary arches. Notice, this is another key to look at. Notice this nice flat arch rafter system in Yuan room, and this simple little beam and a simple 5th purlin or 7th purlin. And it starts getting more complex as you go half in the circle in green. It's all based on that, how many cones and arms they have in here. And then knowing the fish, they start, notice this little bracket here. So, they've gone from this tight stack here to knowing the fish, the first of the brackets. See, and holding a whole nother rafter out here. And then you get to painted boat in this rain. This is outside the main space. Here you've got this column out here on this special bracket there. Flowers washed in spring rain. Again, it's a little bit more elaborated bracket. And then power of cosmic reflections. You can see they start expressing the rafters further out. So here's that framing in Tower of Cosmic Reflections. And so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then there's an implied 7th out there with this rafter. You see they drop the columns off in that main T-space. And again, all kinds of interesting anvil beams there. Scholars study Celestial Hall. You can remember I talked about the very simple arch in the Yuan room on the way to the bathroom there. Look at what they've done here with this arch. It's become a much more elaborate. They've created an anvil and bracket beam rather than just a simple beam across here. They've expanded it with another bracket to carry that little rafter. All of that is considered the 7th purlin right there. All of that. And then you get the hollow-brocaded clouds, even more. They've tripled the anvil beam there, an even more elaborate horseshoe arch, and then they extended it even more with this bracket carrying those rafters. All of this is considered, I consider that the secondary arch. So again, they keep playing with that. And so HR is thinking about, he's talking with Master Chen, and he starts opening up a little bit more, and he starts talking about his time in Beijing, and he starts talking about, the 9-column halls in the Forbidden City. So when we get to 9, so here's the 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's 8, and here's 9. And so when you get to a 9-column hall, there's all kinds of things you can do with it. You could have 2 hallways here, and 2 separate rooms completely. Maybe the concubines live on either side of here, and then you keep them apart with a double corridor and a primary gathering hall here, right? So there's all kinds of things you can do with a 9-column hall. And again, 507 BC. Adherence to the true measures of our patron saint will bring forth wealth and rank and ample farmlands as well. If the people of the present age do not obey the method of the immortal master, disharmony between the houses and its occupants will be the result. So, for 5 days there will be perpetual love for 1,000 and 10,000 years, right? So, a lot of things are at stake in these 9-column halls. So here's an overall view of the Forbidden City, and that is the highest status hall in the entire empire. And so we're talking, this is a SketchUp model that I actually got online from somebody who spent a lot of time doing a SketchUp model, but it's really wonderful. And you can see how that threshold concept that I was talking about has been expanded. Again, the highest ranking building in the entire empire. All these multiple layers and steps to get up there. The major threshold to get up there, a huge threshold to step over. You have to bow to meet the emperor as you're stepping over that threshold. And we're talking about the Hall of Supreme Harmony, that hall right there. And when you look at the Hall of Supreme Harmony, how do you get this huge space of a Supreme Harmony? How do you count 9? So here's, I gave you the 9 numbers, but even that's a little hard to follow, so I did this one for you. Okay, so here's column 1, and then the bracketing. Here's column 2, and the bracketing off of that. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right? So, and that's, again, the highest status hall in the entire world, and that is all one big space under those 9 purlins. So, here's the status of the section, 3, 5, 7, 9. And going back to that diagram that I started you with, I had a professor named John Bracken who was from Holland in college, in graduate school, and he was really big into public housing in Holland in the 1960s. And our entire semester was spent on creating a single section and how many variations you could do off of that section. And so this study that I've done here is sort of based on that semester I did with John Brocken, with the idea that you take a single section and all the variations you can do in terms of spaces within these simple columns. And so, following my system, here's the all one space, right? Or space and side space and circulation and secondary completes in secondary different rooms. You can have a bigger secondary room and a more private hall, right? And so you can see all of these variations just based on that one section. And the richness you can get out of building 9 columns, with 9 columns. So then HR and Master Chen are talking away, and then all of a sudden Master Chen says, so let's see here. I'm trying to get my little board here. So Master Chen asked about whether HR knows who is the master of the mountains in the district. And all of a sudden, HR realizes that Master Chen got him talking a little bit in a little more than a non-humble way, and he realizes he's being networked because what always has been going on throughout Chinese history, and this is a whole other specialty study, which is totally fascinating, was that land tenure and resources had always been part of the Chinese government and bureaucracy. It's called Yuan, and it was a little bit more. It's been documented back in time, but when you get into, as you see here, Suzhou and the Tang Dynasty, as you get further into the Qing, Song, and Ming Dynasty, the government has gotten so expansive that there's all kinds of levels of people involved in resources, and it's very hard to find any information. I've spent many hours trying to find more information about what and how you procure building materials in the Ming Dynasty. In other words, when you're building a high-status hall, you need good quality logs, right? You need to get these logs from somewhere. You needed to get permits or an acknowledgement from the master of forests and rivers and lakes to cut these logs to get them from somewhere, right? And so what I don't know, and maybe there's someone out here who does, but what was the networking and the social contract and who paid who to be allowed to cut the pine and the namu to actually create a high status hall. And so what's fascinating is this Yuan official in the early days was responsible for governing the mountains. And in your clear description of the official post functions in the Qing Dynasty. And he was still in charge of mountains, forests, rivers, and lakes. And you get down here, and rivers, firewood, farmland, and hunting. And they had rules, ecological rules about not hunting or cutting in the wrong times. Hunting's permitted no hunting is permitted within 150 kilometers of the city centers. So there was rules out there, ecological rules and resource rules that would be fascinating to dive into, especially later on when things became a little bit more scarce and population was increasing. So HR looks out the window and he's realizing that he's getting a little bit played here, and he's looking again. He's in the second floor. He's looking down over the roofs of the garden, and this is one of the things that I'm actually skipped over in the matrix for you because it's a very complex, very detailed discussion. Here's the Hut of Five Mountains, and he's looking down over all these overhangs and so forth. And again, it's very context-driven discussion. I can do it, but it's not. It's difficult. But you're looking at ridges, and Master Chen asks HR, "So how is your measuring project going on?" And HR, Hairui, became known in time because he formalized this mapping system, how you map and calculate the areas of land in farmland so they can be taxed. And like death and taxes, there was a huge thing, obviously, in the Chinese world. So when you had lots of property and they weren't exactly rectangular, how were they measured? So Hairui's true government effort was formalizing these tax maps, where all of these characters, how the size of the page, how it was measured. When you had a parallelogram in a field, how you calculated it. You calculated it by a rectangle and you chopped off those triangles, and that's how you calculated the area. You can measure that side based on your rectangle, and so and he became known for adamantly pushing this to create taxes and to be more fair, because the wealthy property owners were, oh, this is too complex, we never can figure out exactly what our fields are, and they weren't paying their fair share, and just like in our world today, right? The middle class, you get taxed, and the wealthy figure out ways not to. In fact, Ming gardens were tax loopholes. If it was considered a garden, that land was not taxed, right? So capital gains, right? So nothing's changed, but so this is what Hairui is known for, is this formalizing this tax code and collecting taxes and pushing the fairness of that tax. So, Master Chen is asking, so how is this going? And then HR start talking about it, and then Master Chen just basically says, other brothers may not be so complimentary. And that was all, he sort of just left that conversation. HR sort of like takes a little breath back, knowing that he's starting to get pushed a little bit here, and looks out the window and he looks at the ridges. So, again, Lansu's ridges, this is sort of an interesting exception. This hall gets a little bit more fancy tying into the entrance, but you have the simple ridge of the Yuan. These gable ends in the language of ridges and eaves start adding to the status of that, and those are in those very fine points of ridge design, to the point where that becomes then capped. And so here is a painted boat. You got the double gable eave ridge being expanded. This whole thing becomes this gable cap, so I'll call that the expansion of the status there. Again, the four-sided, that's the structure that's being hidden from that other slide. All up in there is all being hidden. Again, a simple ridge, but very expanded with this gable ridge combination. Then you get these two. These were just rebuilt. They did a really excellent job at. Did he do the guy that did the roof repair? Did he do a lecture for you guys a year ago or so? Maybe not.
He did at the garden.
Yeah, at the garden. Okay. But one of the wonderful things about this scholarly study ridge is they expand it with this three-dimensional perforated ornament, but these are stacked tiles that are stacked one inside the other, right? But then, so you take this idea where you have this tile repeated there, so it's a really wonderful repeat. You create an ornament out of the same material, but all you're doing is getting the edge. And then you get to the hollow brocaded clouds, and you have the whole full expanded ridge, obviously the dragonfish, and you take these roof tiles and basically you take this U and you go like this, or like this, and that's what creates this pattern, right? That's a roof tile down and then up, right? And then on the side. And so you're getting a repetition of shape that create that expanded ridge, expanded detail, and so forth. So believe it or not, we've now gotten through 100, right? The 10 halls, the 10 rows, and with a few exceptions, and as I said, I jumped you on the Eve and I jumped you on the Mandarin panel, but other than that, we've gone through the 100. So, HR thinks back to his time in Beijing, and he knows he's gotten a bit played here, and he thinks back to the high status ridge in the entire dynasty. And this is on the Hall of Supreme Harmony. You have these 9 guardian animals. There's a debate about whether this is a person hung for greed or a scholar riding a guilin, which is a combination lion-bird. You have a guard with a cane or a sword guarding the 9 dynamic animals, and then here's the emperor overlooking everything. Again, that is the highest status ridge in the entire empire. And so you think of that compared to our ridge at Hall of Rotating Clouds, right? All of a sudden, Master Chen goes quiet, and he's looking back down at his painting, and HR realizes the conversation is probably over. And so, as I say, the threat has been received, and so the servant gives him a little nod. You see, outside that Ginkgo screen, and HR gets up and walks around the corner. He's standing there in the corner of right there on that balcony I showed you. He's looking down over the eaves, and here's Lan Su, and as part of the high status of the Hall of Rotating Clouds, we have the 3 plenties plus 1. It's the only roof in Lan Su that has the 4 flower pots there. And on the side facing the Tranquility Courtyard, the entrance courtyard, you have the pomegranate and the peach. The pomegranate represents abundance of many offspring. The peach is longevity peach. When you eat it, you live 10,000 years. When you have a birthday cake, when you're 65 years old, you have a birthday. The bun that you have is in the shape of a peach. There's like all good things in all of Chinese symbolism, there's multiple meanings because it's very wholesome, right? What could be more wholesome than abundance of many offspring and longevity and in life? But wink, wink, nod, nod, those are also fertility symbols that are carved into the bedposts of the concubines. Right? So there's like, when you have your buddies over for a scholar gathering, there's always multiple meanings in that. So then the 3 plenties plus 1 over here when you're in the lake, there's the plus 1 is the plum. That flower pot right here is the plum, is the 5 happinesses. But then you get this last pot here, which is a whole loaded treasure trove in itself. And so HR knows that he's in trouble again, again in 1570. And he thinks back to the Chen brothers who lived here in 1032 and 1033. Chen Hao was kind-hearted, conciliatory, mild like the sun in spring, but his younger brother was cold and harsh like the hoarfrost in autumn. And these 2 brothers wrote Confucian manuscripts, and they were very, very famous. And Chen Ying, most famous thing is the principle of one thing is one with the principle of all. So if you really understand the basic principle of one, you won't be so far off. And knowledge forms the basis for self-cultivation and conduct, and that's what Hai Rui live by. And to attain knowledge, one must apprehend the principle of things. To apprehend the principle of things, you must investigate them. And then when investigation has been practiced over a long period of time, does it become possible to reach a free comprehension and knowledge of sincerity. And that point, emotional and moral life is in balance. So that centers HR. He knows that things are going to be tough again, but if I stick to his principles, he's going to be okay. And so he looks out there and he sees the Buddha's hand. And Buddha's hand, you have the protection of the Buddha, in Buddhist hand. It looks like two hands. But one of the most important things of Buddhist hand is it represents the idea that the true value of knowledge is when you make knowledge your own. And that's how I'll finish up.
So anyways, we have a Q&A, and so we'll take questions orderly. So you kind of raise your hand, we'll recognize you. We'll start right off here. Here's the mic. Thank you.
I'm sorry if I missed this, but do the old Chinese houses with the high threshold, does that threshold have a purpose, a practical value or impact?
There is a sort of a fun email thing that's going around for years and years and years. The origins of the term threshold, and so what that claims is the origin of the term threshold is back in the days when you had mud floors and you used thresh, hay, straw to compact it down to insulate your floors and create a floor that you lived in so you're not on the mud. And so that threshold is holding the depth of your thresh at the doorway, right? And so supposedly that is the origin of the term threshold. It makes sense, but it's one of those, is it a myth or not? But that's.
So great job, Ken, first of all. But I think I made you leave one thing out that might make people understand this. Can you not hear me? I said, great job. I think I made you leave one thing out that, yeah, well, we chose to leave that one thing out. But when you said like, okay, well, he was being played, you didn't say the beginnings of HR when he was jailed because he was so honest with that other member. Did you say that? Or did
I said it quickly, right?
Did you answer that?
I did.
Oh, okay, so I missed that. So you said that he was played. Why was he invited there? What did he want from him? I didn't really get that. Yeah.
Okay, so in my story, Master Chen has invited HR there, one he compliments him initially on the success of his tax policies, but then my quote that I make up is, other brothers may not be so complimentary. In other words, there is a large group of wealthy people here in town that are not so happy with your tax programs. And in 1570, he's then banished again and kicked out of government, and he goes back to Henan for 15 more years. And then after 15 more years, the honesty and integrity catches up to him again. He's hired to go back to Nanjing as an old man and start again as an official censor, and he dies in Nanjing at about 80 years old or something like that. But so anyway, that's kind of Hai Rui's life, a little bit more expanded. But
Any more questions?
I have one more minute. I'm just curious, but I need that. You don't need that. Well, I thought it was interesting about all the different hierarchies in Chinese architecture. Was that then transferred to European architecture? Any of these symbols?
well,
Not the whole bunch.
yeah. I mean, as I said, my favorite is Vienna and the urban scale. Obviously, we all are very used to reading the techniques in European architecture. The Ionic, the Corinthian Ionic, and the Doric Ionic and Corinthian columns. As these columns get more and more elaborate, you think of the Parthenons up onto a base. We all, just like when we look at cars in our world, we're sort of clued into the amount of effort and detail that goes into a neoclassical building. One of my premises of why I find the classical Chinese gardens so fascinating is when you build in America, And this is what Frank Lloyd Wright tried to do, was he tried to create a new language. When you build here in America, we're a melting pot. We don't have a real culture to build to. As an architect, how do you build to someone's culture? What was going on here and what this lecture talks about is 5,000 years of common culture, symbol, and attitudes. And this architecture was developed on a 5,000-year single language understanding, right? And so this architecture has a 5,000-year history. When you're talking about building in America, what do you build to? What are people's aspirations? What are people's symbols? And so Frank Lloyd Wright tried to create a new thing, and he was talented enough to be able to start one. But again, we're so fractured, there's nothing really that you can really read other than size in our society in terms of this status. And it's, obviously in my jaded architectural world, it's gotten worse and worse and worse.
Okay, question here. You're next.
Maybe I missed this, but who lived, what rank of person lived in the masters of the fishing net garden in Sung and then also in Qing?
Okay, I don't know.
Is this a high official?
Yes.
Or?
Yes. So the person who would have been able to afford the beginnings of the master of the fish net would have been a very high-ranking official. The most famous one in Suzhou is the Garden of the Humble Administrator.
Yeah.
And that's the most famous, it's the largest of Suzhou. The name of that comes from someone who was so high-ranking that he worked in Beijing, but then Suzhou was known for these high-ranking Beijing officials retiring to Suzhou. And it was these very, Suzhou was at the very north end with Hangzhou, which was the silk area where the mulberry trees grew, and Hangzhou is still famous for its silk. And Suzhou as well. The Silk Institute is in Suzhou, right? So there was wealth there with the silk industry, but it also had the climate that was more beneficial than living in Beijing. And so these government officials all retired, and it was a critical mass. It was people of common status, common intellect. Again, these were the most brilliant people in man's history, right? And so you hang together, you party together, you converse together.
And that was still true in Qing?
Yes.
There's a question right here.
Excuse me.
Well, I'll just shout it out, okay? Is there, these principles you described, is modern Chinese architecture using any of those in any ways, or any effort made to carry through these traditions? Or are they branching out too far from that?
If you're a Feng Shui master, I noticed I didn't bring in Feng Shui, and a little bit with the catching the axle, the spirit coming down through the axis. Feng Shui, you're familiar with it, is again a 5,000-year system of how you build to create luck and auspicious things. And so a Feng Shui master in modern day China can be paid thousands of dollars an hour for their consultations. So, and sometimes when things like a high-rise building has gone wrong, they'll bring in Feng Shui consultants even in today's world, and it's like, why are this business failing at, this high-rise versus another high-rise? And so they're still using it. Obviously in the structural systems, not so much. People are starting to look backwards a little bit more. But obviously, you're also talking about techniques and a whole different level of investment. But the Feng Shui stuff is being recognized. One of the more interesting ones that was one of the great failures in modern architecture is in London, in what they call the walkie-talkie building. If you're familiar with that, it's a high-rise in London. I forget the architect. But things, you can do anything in today's world structurally so that the high-rise bends like this, right? And what they didn't realize is when the sun hits, it's just like almost like a solar collector mirror, and it's literally burning cars on the street. Because the sun is hitting this concave thing and literally firing down like a laser beam. It's literally burned up cars on the street. And this is a classic feng shui screw up in terms of not thinking about what's your south-facing thing doing. And what the feng shui term is throwing poison darts. You don't want a gable or a ridge pointing at your house, in other words, right? And so, like, if your neighbor has a gable and ridge pointing at you, you want to do certain things like wind chimes and other things to help protect that energy coming at you, being thrown and poison darts thrown at you. So that stuff, that's a whole other.
Okay, next question, final winner.
It's beneath the master of Nat's garden, or humble administrator's garden. There's a room there that I found particularly charming. It seems like when you describe the architecture, it had two contradictory things going on. I don't know if you remember, it's a low ceiling room with a dark plank ceiling, and it has windows on one side and sort of on a secluded, sort of bamboo area. But the room has, on one side, one wall is almost entirely these little shallow, sort of brackets and shelves that have really elegant pottery. And on the opposite wall, there's a long, very nicely done painting. So it seems like on the art furnishings, it's very, very high quality, but and be a very humble kind of environment and feels in this little bit hard of the interior of that garden.
In which one, the master or humble?
Yeah, and I don't remember which it was, you just resaw the books.
Yeah, these, here again, master fishnets, there's a whole nother world. This is the Scholar Garden built in Astor Court. And there's a whole other world over here as well. So it's really pretty amazing in terms of the level of stuff going on in this garden.
There we go.
Are your materials anywhere available? I'd love to look at them again, because they're so beautiful.
Yeah, I can, most of these, the slides that I have transitions on are hard to get PDFs.
Just the ones that have, like, the most information.
Yeah, I can do PDFs or of the system and make them into JPEGs, and I can email them to you, and then.
Because I'd love to be able to read through it again, because there's just so much information in some of the slides that just have a lot of things.
My question is, you quoted some sources from 500 BC. How far back does this kind of style go, and how consistent was it for at least the 2,500 years you were talking about?
Let me jump to another slide here.
Would you repeat the question? It's hard to hear.
Okay. I'll look at that.
Okay. So this is my pictorial bibliography.
What my question was he mentioned sources from 500 BC. I want to know how far back the style went and how consistent it's been over time.
So the quick answer is it's been very consistent. The Qing, which is 1644 up until 1904, 14, however you want to call it, was more heavily got influenced by Europeans. So the last of the dynasties, the Qing dynasty, did get cross-pollinated with European. You'll see more axial things. Previously the only axial architecture was the emperor, because he was the only one that could create symmetry in the world. One of my theories of Ming Dynasty design and garden is that in the Suzhou in Lansu, the whole idea of being monotone, grays and browns and whites, is that you're not competing with the emperor who had the golden roofs and the multi-polycolor, right? These scholars had to be very, very careful that you're not stepping on the authority or the power in any way of the emperor, right? But by the time the Qing dynasty gets around, this whole idea of axial development and geometric shrubberies and things like that start creeping in. The important thing about Chinese architecture was that they really didn't have architects. This book here, Chinese Architecture, is a compilation of a husband-wife architectural team that came to study at University of Pennsylvania and Harvard in the 1920s and 30s. They were one of the very first quote-unquote architects in China. And they went back to China, fortunately in the 1930s, because they knew that ancient architecture was starting to get disappeared. And they started doing a lot of measured drawings, they started developing things, and they were the ones that sort of dug up a lot of the old texts. But when you're reading Chinese, you can't sound things out, right? A character is a word, and when you're reading a text from I think they talk about there was a bunch of craftsman notes about how you build. They no longer knew what those characters meant. The terms had disappeared. And so, when things were being labeled with a character, nobody was around to tell them what that was any longer. So they had to rebuild the language from those craftsman notes of I think it was 1200 or 1400 or something like that. But this is a fantastic book in terms of that. And they went throughout China and they measured and photographed a lot of the old ancient buildings just prior to World War II. And then obviously between the Japanese bombings and then Civil War, this becomes one of the best information on that, old architecture. So this is my pictorial bibliography for you. You probably recognize most of these. This one, if you're into Confucian, this one is a great book, Confucian Rule. If you're interested in Ming Dynasty gardens, in our garden Lan Su, Fruitful Sites is probably the densest. Basically, it reads like a PhD thesis that was published. And so but if you're looking at how Ming Dynasty architecture is tied to Ming society, this is the end all of all that I've seen. Fruitful Sites is absolutely amazing. So anyway.